listening to an audiobook is not the same as reading a book. The big question of our audiobooks reading is one that has been going around and around and around and around to the point of making somebody nauseous, specifically on BookTube for a little bit here. And the problem is that everybody knows on a very literal level that the question is not, is listening to a book the exact same physical action as reading a book? The question is it equivalent, or is it a similar or equivalent experience as you have reading a book? Not, is one thing literally something else? So that's the first problem that we run into with this discussion. My issue is that with many of the videos that I've seen on this topic, not all, but many of them come from people who either don't listen to audiobooks very much, or from people who actively say that audiobooks don't work for them, or they dislike them, or they have other significant issues with them. Now, it's not to say that there's no value in listening to that perspective, but I want to give the perspective from somebody who has spent, their entire life reading and had a real hard time with audiobooks when I first started listening. I couldn't finish them because I'd get bored, I'd get distracted, I had a hard time being consistent. There's many that I didn't finish, and the ones that I did listen to would take me forever. One of the first audiobooks that I completed in its entirety was Dune, and I think it took me like 6 months from start to finish to get through all of Dune. So I want to give the perspective of somebody who came from a camp of exclusively reading with my eyes when I was doing my reading, to somebody where now in the stage of life that I'm at right now, I'd say easily half of the books that I go through, if not 2/3, are through audiobooks rather than physically reading. And that's just the phase that we're in now. So I want to help give a little bit of a different perspective here on this question and actually make the argument that in some circumstances, audiobooks are actually better than physically reading. And people will always say it depends on the person, it depends on the audiobook, and it depends on the book. And all three of those things are true. But given that, let's entertain the idea that there are circumstances in which, and maybe not uncommon circumstances, in which an audiobook can be better than actually reading a book physically with your eyes. And the other thing that I'd like to do is refute some of the common claims that I hear people say when they are dunking on audiobooks and promoting physically reading. So first of all, obviously, I'm not saying don't physically read, and I'm also not saying don't do something that doesn't work for you. So there are some people where they say, I don't enjoy the experience as much, I don't get as much out of the books. Fair enough. Do what works best for you. What I would like to go over here, though, is that there are some big pieces of misinformation. There are some misconceptions that get presented that I'd like to clear up here. So first of all, a couple obvious things to clear up. We've already talked about it's not literally reading, and that also people will always say that listening to stories being told or listening to information being taught to you is much older and predates people like sitting down and reading it. So I think people universally can agree on that. So, in some ways, people will cheekily even say that in some ways audiobooks are more like reading because that's more in line of how people have historically learned than sitting down and physically reading. And some work better from other people. Some people are dyslexic or they have other disabilities that prevent them from physically reading. And so for them, audiobooks are obviously a much better option. So some people learn better more one way than another. All of those obvious, and it depends on the situation, things aside, let's go into this. First of all, one of the claims that I'd like to kind of refute is that people say that reading is an active thing and listening is a passive thing. And I think this takes a really big assumption and shows that just by making that claim, the people who make it are not very good listeners, at least not to audiobooks. So let's go over a few things here. First is that if you are a good listener, not just to audiobooks, but to anything, you need to be able to engage your mind. I'm sure every one of us has had a conversation with somebody while they're on their phone or looking at a computer or focusing on something else, maybe doing a task, and you go through, a paragraph and a half, and they stop and they go, huh? What was that? Sorry, I wasn't listening. So listening is an active thing, not just hearing something. If you want to sit, you can sit and play a 24-hour audiobook where you hear it all, but you're not actually listening to it. But if you want to be a good listener, whether it's in conversation or if you're hearing a lecture or a sermon or even, a YouTube video with any level of meat to it, then listening is something that's active. It's not passive. you can passively hear things, but you're not going to retain information like that. So if people are saying that just hearing in an audiobook in one ear and out the other, well, that's fine. But the active listening muscle that you exercise is very similar to that active muscle that you use when you're sitting down, you're blocking out all other distractions, noisy neighbors down the street, people in the other room, and you choose to focus on just the words on the page as you're reading through a book. The other thing that I'd like to bring up with listening to audiobooks specifically is that this is a learned skill. Most people that I know who listen to a lot of audiobooks were not great at it on day one. They didn't start out being great. In fact, many people will say that they had to get better. It was something that they had to exercise with. And I know that's certainly true for myself. I already mentioned at the beginning of this video, when I first listened to Dune, it took me months and months to get through. Whereas now, through discipline, through being able to focus better, I'm able to get through audiobooks much faster. And this has nothing to do with speeding up the audio. And in fact, with Dune, there were parts that I'd have to go back over because I missed something. And as you do it more, as with any skill, you get better at it. And I would guarantee that most people, when they started reading, as a child or as a younger person, that they didn't start being as good of a reader as they are today. It took work. It took work being able to drown out the distractions around them. It took work being able to, there's people who read while they walk on a treadmill, or who read while they're working out, or read doing all sorts of different activities where they're doing other things simultaneously as they're reading. And it took work for them to be able to focus on the words on the page and receive that information while at the same time doing something else without using, the main part of your memory, all the memory that's stored up, as it were. And so there's a similar principle there with audiobooks. Many of the detractors will say, well, you're often listening to audiobooks while you drive in the car, or whether you're doing chores, or this or that and the other. And that's true. But that same skill that you use to tone out the noisy neighbors, or the person in the other room, or the dishwasher running, all of those skills that you use while reading are similar skills that you have to hone and get better at while you listen to things as well. So it's a very similar principle and muscle that's applied here. Another thing that people will say is that reading, you can slow down. You can go at your own pace. And I've heard one person who specifically made the criticism that with an audiobook, it's just constant noise. It becomes hours upon hours upon hours of listening. It becomes exhausting. It's nonstop. And I really think that this is, once again, the sign of somebody who is not practiced the skill of listening, and specifically listening to something over a long period of time. When I first started, and I know other people have experienced this as well, you can get burned out. You can start to have your ears kind of glaze over if you just have a nonstop bombardment of audiobook for 8 hours a day while you're working, or even longer. But for me, so let's take during a work day, I might listen for a bit in the morning and then stop and listen to a podcast, or listen to music, or listen to nothing at all, or have another task where I can't listen to anything while I'm doing that. So this idea of just nonstop noise really comes from a lack of pacing yourself as a listener. So that's more of a problem with the user rather than a problem with the actual concept of listening. Now let's go on to another point where I think audiobooks actually might have the upper hand to physically reading something. And this is going to be that audiobooks actually force you to slow down. So I know that there's sort of the fringe examples that people point to of some people listen on double, triple, 4 times speed. Okay, most audiobook listeners won't do that. Some narrators are slow, and so it's actually easier to listen to them at 1.25, 1.5, etc., because it helps them speak at a more of a normal rate of speech and helps you listen better. But barring the double, triple times speed people, listening to an audiobook actually forces you to slow down with the text you are receiving. A lot of people speed read, even for people who sub-vocalize, where they read and they actually sound out every word in their head as they read along. Even for them, that is faster for most people than listening to your average audiobook. So when you listen to an audiobook, you can't just speed run through something. It forces you to stop and mark every word that's being spoken and actually hear every word that's being spoken on the page. I don't know how many readers that I've heard where they talk about if there's like a song or a poem in the book that they kind of glaze over it. There are even people who say, I don't really care about battle scenes, I just kind of skip to the end and find out what happened. If there's epigraphs at the beginning of chapters, a lot of readers say they skim over those. I'm even guilty of some of these myself. But with an audiobook, you can't do that. You're forced to stop, you're forced to listen, and you're forced to pay attention, equal attention, to those parts as you are with dialogue or something that maybe another reader would call more interesting. So even if listening to an audiobook opens up more time where you're able to receive more books and you're able to go through more stories, even if it opens that up for you, the books that you're going through, you go through at a slower pace than if you were reading them physically. You're not able to speed read through them. You're not able to skim over parts. You're not able to jump around like some people do when they're reading. So this idea that some people present of audiobook people are just slamming through it quickly, really, once again, that's an error with a bad reader who's going at double, triple time speed, because the average audio experience will not be that. And then the third point, and this is the one that I would really like to highlight, is that audiobook listening, depending on the book, can actually improve your experience with the book. And here, we're going to get into some examples. So, The Way of Shadows is a fantasy novel by Brent Weeks. One could say famously or infamously by Brent Weeks. And I believe it was almost 2 years ago where I picked this up for the first time. I read about 100 pages, and for those who don't know, this is Brent Weeks' first novel. And he wrote this when he was in his early 20s, I believe. And I'll say, it shows. If you read Aragon or Elantris or most any other fantasy novel debut by a young author, you usually can see some cracks in the novel. And The Way of Shadows, that is very much true. Brent Weeks, in terms of this trilogy, and there's a lot that I really love about this trilogy, but his actual writing, his prose writing, is not his strongest point. And because of really cringy dialogue or turns of phrase that just bugged me, I actually put the book down. I dropped it. I said, nope, not doing this. And I had different copies of it at the time, and I got rid of those copies. Then I gave it about 6 to 8 months, another year. It was the next year by then. And I picked up the audiobook. And the audiobook is read by the one and only Simon Vance, who's obviously a legend in the audiobook space. And Simon Vance's reading of the exact same lines helped me get through the book and enjoy it significantly more. Because of how good of a reader he was able to take lines that were cringier or worse sounding in my head or were worse simply on paper and make them sound better simply because of how he delivered them, because of how he presented them. So an audiobook, if you've got a good reader, can improve weaker writing or weaker prose in a book. Let's look at another point here, and that is that an audiobook narrator, if you've got a good one, once again, can make a book come alive in a new way. So the example I'm going to use here is The Fellowship of the Ring. So The Fellowship of the Ring is sort of infamous in one point that's different from the movies, which is there's about 2 to 3 chapter digression that's near the beginning about Tom Bombadil. And Tom Bombadil is divisive. Some people love him, some people hate him. But I've heard from many readers who have said that they put down Fellowship of the Ring multiple times, but when they finally got it on audio and had Andy Serkis narrating Tom Bombadil, who, let's say, gives a very bombastic performance as him, when he does all of Bombadil's songs and mannerisms, he almost shouts them, which is quite the amusing interpretation in my mind. But they were able to enjoy the parts with Tom Bombadil because it was being read to them by Andy Serkis, and the way Serkis presented them and the way Serkis sang out Bombadil's silly songs made them appreciate that as a character and find him actually amusing as a character, whereas before they were just annoyed that they were bogged down by this long digression. There wasn't a personality to it just in the written word. So this is another example of an audiobook narrator, a good narrator, can take text that previously, when you read it, seemed dead, seemed flat, seemed uninteresting, and made it come alive. Now, for the record, I love Tom Bombadil. I've always loved Tom Bombadil. I think Serkis does a great job, but even written, you guys need to stop hating on my boy Tom Bombadil. He's great. But that's another point where This is a place where audiobooks can actually improve the experience. The next one is going to be that a narrator can make difficult writing more clear. So for this example, we're going to talk about The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. So New Sun famously has some dense prose, some difficult writing to get into, and it depends on what level of a reader you are as to whether or not you find it challenging or not. But there's enough people who find it challenging that it has a reputation. And there are readers that I know of and that I've spoken to who said that they read the first couple of chapters and felt like they felt stupid reading it, like they couldn't understand what was being described or what Wolfe was getting at, or they couldn't picture the scenes. But then when they listened to the audiobook, and also, before we get to that, in New Sun, Wolfe uses a lot of words, rather than making up alien words for places or people or animals. He uses words from other languages, or he uses old extinct English words that aren't used anymore. And so, for some people, that can be very confusing and very jarring, where you're like, what's a Carnifax? What? But when they listen to it on audiobook, whether it was the difficult prose or whether it was the obscure words that Wolfe was using, because of the context, because of the delivery of it, they were able to make sense of it. They were able to picture the scenes better. It wasn't as challenging for them. So in situations where there's difficult prose to grasp, hearing it rather than reading it can make the experience of going through that book that much more clear. So those are 3 points that we'll go over as far as how listening to a book can actually be an improved on experience rather than just simply reading it. But it is a distinctly different experience, and I will give you that, and I think that's important to acknowledge. It is different, but it is of the same type. It's in the same way that a wolf is different than a dog, but it is of a same type. You are still going through the same book. You are still going through the same words. You are still experiencing the same story. It is just in the way that your brain takes in the information, you're using one set of holes versus a different set. One final digression that I will make here, which is just that some books are better suited to audio. And that's just a simple fact. Some books are a lot simpler to get a handle of. They're less confusing on audio, or they work better on audio than they do in written form. And then there are some books just in written form that are just going to be more of a challenge if you try to listen to it, whether that's because of a narrator or because a book is so complicated that it might be harder to hold all the moving pieces in your head if you're not actually seeing them on a page or consulting, say, glossary or map or what have you. Now, that all depends on the reader, the listener, and it depends on the book. So that's one thing. The other thing is there are definitely some things that books are uniquely situated to do that audiobooks can't do. And this usually has to do with playing with the form of the written word. So one example would be that in The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, the sequel to The Name of the Wind, there's a character that our main character meets who is a fae character. She's a fairy-like character. Her name's Felurian. And when Felurian talks, all of her sentences, and Rothfuss does something really interesting here to create an otherworldly feeling about how she talks. First, most of her dialogue is in iambic pentameter, which is unique and crazy that he went through the time to put that into the book. But the second thing is all of the sentences, when she begins a sentence, don't start with a capitalized letter. And it's a subtle thing, but it creates this feeling of eeriness or feeling slightly unsettled by her, something a little otherworldly, something that sets her apart from the main character. And that's not something that you can replicate in an audiobook, obviously. You can't play with the form of the text in the same way. Another example is going to be in the book Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio. So in this novel, our main character Hadrian is interacting with how would you describe this? An otherworldly, ancient machine-like creature. Let me see if I can find an example of this here. And so you can see in the text of this that when Hadrian talks, it's laid out like a normal paragraph. And then when this other being talks, it's in bold, it's offset, there's weird formatting. That's not something that you can replicate in an audiobook. So it's not to say that every book will perfectly be a one-for-one translation into the audio format. But some books work much better in the audio format. You take something like the Dresden Files, which famously works very, very well on audio, or the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. Now, both of those, part of why they work so well is because of the excellent narrators. But then books that are told from a first-person perspective, many of those, if you listen to them on audio, can feel very much like you're being told a story. Some, whether it's the Kingkiller Chronicles, Sun Eater, Book of the New Sun, or the Empire of the Vampire series, they're actually like first-person recountings of the story. And some of those are actually the person, like the Kingkiller Chronicles, Kvothe is actually telling his story verbally to the chronicler for most of the book. And so it's actually being written down as it's being spoken. So those ones specifically, it would make sense for somebody to listen to them. So anyway, there is a bit of a push and pull. They are different mediums, but in terms of going through a book, it is the same thing. And there are places where audiobooks actually have the upper hand. And that's something that I feel like does not get enough attention in this discussion. Let me know what you guys think about this, what your experience with this has been. Once again, do what works for you as far as going through the books that you want to go through. I know some people who just, it absolutely does not work listening to stuff. They tone it out, they haven't practiced listening to it as well as maybe some other people have, and it's not a great option for them. I know other people where, because of their job, because of their family life, what have you, audiobooks are the only way they go through books. So do what works for you. But I kind of wanted to present some of these points here, and hopefully it's not just regurgitating what everybody else has said. And if it is, I'm sorry. But thanks for watching this today. Hope you're doing well. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.